The human brain. The center of human intelligence. The brainstem controls actions of the body that are automatic. It controls learned and conscious behavior. These transmit impulses from the nerve cells throughout the brain and out to the rest of the nervous system.
Okay, you know what's kind of fun for me is after that sort of 1950s/1960s psychedelic, weird, drug-saturated, artful-looking film, I can say, Happy Easter, everybody. And wasn't exactly doing the whole lilies and bunny rabbits thing, wasn't it? I love that. That is to promote the production that Sarah was talking about just a moment ago. And at the end of this month, we're doing a production where we're asking everybody to go to our East Side campus. And we're going to have a time when we explore this whole idea of can you bring your mind to this game called faith, even though it's not called a game. Sorry for that. First of all, before I go on, I want to give a shout out for the last 3 years. We've had to tape our messages because we're one church in different locations. We have a West Side campus. Shout out to the West Side. We have a Henderson campus. Greetings to all of you over in Henderson. But we've had to tape the messages in a studio where it was me and a couple cameras. And just starting last week, we've gotten back to a live thing, which is a whole lot better. Even though I'm extra nervous today because it's Easter and there's all kinds of strangers looking at me and stuff. Yeah, so you can hear the live. All right, so we're doing this Mind Project deal. We're launching the series today. We're using Easter to do that. And the reason for that is a little under a year ago, I noticed that April Fool's Day and Easter share the same date. And I thought, that's kind of strange, it's kind of weird. And I don't remember that ever happening before, honestly. And so I looked it up. It hasn't happened since 1956. And apparently it's never gonna happen again in the history of the entire world, okay? So this is it. That part's not true, but this is it, all right? April Fool. But here's the thing, and then I thought, good grief, what a terrible combination. April Fools and Easter. I mean, we don't take Easter seriously, and there's a whole April Fool going on. And then I thought, well, I'm not trying to be like Mr. Optimist or anything like that. I'm not trying to be Mr. Sunny Side of the Street. But the more I thought about it, is there a great combination? And the reason I can say that is this. I want you to think back. You don't have to raise your hand or anything like this. I want you to think back over your life. And has anyone ever April Fooled you big time? Has anyone ever done that? I mean, let's go ahead and admit it to yourself, like, oh yeah, I remember. Okay, mine was several years ago. It was my wife. She sat me down and said, I'm pregnant. And we were done, right? And I just, kind of did that, and she was just letting that line out, and then finally, April Fool. Like, don't you hate that? Just, I haven't trusted her since. But get this, and she goes, I was talking about this, and a friend of mine, I'm not naming who it is, but they said they also pulled that joke. Apparently it's kind of a universal thing that some of you ladies like to do, and actually rigged the pregnancy test to show her husband. I mean, that's just sick stuff. If you've ever met anybody that do that, never trust them again, okay? Well, what's the whole deal behind April Fools? It's trying to get you to believe something. Just created something. And it introduces a great question. Why do we believe the things that we believe? And I'm not talking about religious categories. I'm talking about any category. Why do you believe the things that you believe? I mean, we live in the age where apparently there's fake news out there. That's what they keep telling us. And they also tell us that the Russians took over Facebook and were throwing all kinds of things. Did any of us believe that? What do we believe? What do we not believe? I had the privilege of sitting under a lecture by a major psychiatrist guy, and he was talking about the design of our brains. And he said that each of us, and I think this was the medical term he used, has a beliefometer inside our brains. We really do. It was beliefometer. Just look it up in the latest medical journals. Now, I don't know what the name of it was, but he said, because we're asking the question, can you use your mind to believe? Or do you have to sacrifice your mind to believe? And I'll give you the answer right ahead. No, you don't have to sacrifice your mind to believe. Because according to him, you can't. He said all of our brains are wired to do the belief-o-meter thing. We do it all the time. We can't help it. It's an automatic thing. Some of you who have never met me before are doing it right now. You can't help it. You're asking the question, do I trust this guy? Do I believe this guy? Do I think he's sincere? All that. And you're doing it based upon my content, but not just that. You're doing it based upon my clothing, how I do my hair. You know, you're checking that out. You're checking the tone of my voice, the pacing of my speaking, and all that sort of stuff. You assess people and things in advance all the time. You can't help it. Now, some of you are on this side of the line. You're kind of a case of real heavy-duty skepticism. You don't trust anybody. You don't trust anything, especially today. You're on the lookout, especially from your wife. You know, don't come with me with that. Could you imagine having to tell your husband you are pregnant and you really are on April 1st? That'd be kind of an interesting thing. You know, so some of you are kind of on the skeptical side. You have a very, very, very narrow bandwidth of belief. Others of you have a wide bandwidth of belief. When you check things out, you kind of believe things first. They're on the hunt for you today, right? People want to know who you are because you're gullible, right? Belief is what this kind of life is all about in many ways. As we relate to one another, you're always checking things out. Now, what the Christian church did 2,000 years ago is it presented before everybody in the world an extraordinary claim, is what it did. That there was this man named Jesus. He did amazing things. He walked around and did a number of things. He died, he was crucified, he was executed, and he was graveyard dead. And he was wrapped up, he was placed in a tomb. And 3 days later, he came back from the dead. And it wasn't a near-death experience. He didn't see a light, go through a tunnel and meet his family members. He didn't do this stuff. He actually literally came back and he's alive to this day. That's what Easter celebrates. And the major question is, do you believe it? If you do believe it, why? If you don't believe it, why not? It's a very important question. And things rise and fall on that deal. Now I'm going to show you an example of this, kind of the passage we're going to live in today. Is found in the Gospel of John. And for those of you who may not be familiar with this thing, the Bible contains basically 4 biographies of Jesus. They are Matthew, they're called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John after their authors. And John is one of the writers who wrote later in life, kind of later than the rest of them. And he's looking back. He's probably about 90 years old. And he's looking back and he tells the resurrection story like all of them do. It's the central theme of this entire deal. It's what we're celebrating today. But right after he gives his resurrection story, he says this, quote, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing, you may have life in his name. This whole thing's about belief. Especially according to him. Scholars of the Gospel of John, there are people that actually study this kind of stuff for a living, will tell you that outside of the person of Jesus himself, belief is the number one issue in the book of John. He mentions that word that we translate believe or believed 98 times. It is his theme, that's what he's after. And what they'll also tell you is that he was after 2 audiences, and it's exactly the same right now. John was apparently, he says, this is why I'm writing. First of all, I want those who don't believe this stuff at all. Maybe they've never heard it, or maybe they've heard it and they've doubted it. But then also on further study, they say they can tell he's trying to help those who believed already. In other words, they did believe the resurrection. They started living, they were following Jesus, but they lived in a culture that challenged them a lot and pushed back on them, and they were struggling with things. And so what he's doing, he's trying to deepen the roots of belief of those who already believed. And guys, that's exactly what I'm hoping to do over the next few moments, and that's really what we'd like to do over the next month around here. We want to ask those of you who don't believe to kind of consider some things, be open-minded and weigh out some stuff. But we also want to talk to those of you who do believe, but you live in a culture where it can be a struggle, it can be hard. And my question for the first group is, if you don't believe, why not? What's standing in your way? And for the second group, if you do believe, can your belief tolerate pushback and difficulty and challenge? Let's think of it that way. All right, so using kind of his paragraph as an outline, It says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. One of the things I love about, and one of the reasons I believe this guy is telling me the truth, is because he's very honest about his motives. He says, I'm not trying to, inform your curiosity or satisfy your curiosity or anything like that. I'm trying to get you to believe. I really am. And the scholars will also tell you that the book of John is divided up into 7 different signs. See, he's honest about his edits. He says there's lots of things I could have recorded about Jesus. I wish you would have recorded more, honestly. But he thought back and he thought of 7 different things. He did a bunch of stuff, but I picked out the 7 I thought would really, really help push you over the line. And you can go back. They're everything from, taking one lunch and feeding thousands of people to he heals a man born blind. He does all kinds of things like that to get people to believe. And then the 8th sign, they say, is the resurrection itself. The resurrection is presented as a thing to be believed. Now, here's the problem. If I put myself in the place of those of you in the room that are here because, you're here to support your family, kind of do the Easter thing because that's what we do in this culture and better show up on church at Easter, you're an extra heathen. People look down on you and all that. But you're here, but you don't really believe it. If I put myself in your shoes, I think the first place of doubt is whether I'm making a big deal out of this paragraph. It would be, how do I know that paragraph was written by the guy who claims to write it, right? You ever had that problem before? We make a big deal of the Bible says this. Well, and it's claiming to be an eyewitness account that John, I'm a guy who followed him around and I'm writing this. My name is John, I'm writing in the 1st century. You can trace it all the way back. But the problem is, how do you know? Some of you think, well, how do you know it wasn't Fred like the 5th century or something like that? Even though I don't think there was anybody named Fred in the 5th century. But there was, how do I know it's not that, right? Well, okay, full disclosure, it's funny, I was gonna look at this kind of a little bit more in depth, and I listened to a previous tape of myself explaining this, and I felt like I did such a bad job, I'm not gonna do it today, okay? But what I will say is this, if you struggle with how do I know what's written there was actually written all the way back then, it's the easiest one to answer. It's just not easy to answer in a short form. There's a science called textual criticism. In other words, how can they know? Because Dan Brown's written kind of these, what do they call it? Conspiracy theory kinds of books where it's, the Catholic Church is kind of giving out these documents and Fred really is in the 5th century writing legends down and all that. How do they know that's not true? They know it through textual criticism. In other words, there's tons of manuscripts out there that scientists look at and everything else. For the manuscript, for instance, of the author Homer, for those of you who were forced to read Homer back in high school and college, Homer's Iliad, there's 2,000 ancient documents, and they look at them and they try to size them up to see which is authentic and what was really written. For the New Testament, there are 23,986 manuscripts, partial or full manuscripts, that they look at and they study. And what I'm gonna do is, instead of trying to explain it further, I'm gonna give you a couple of resources if you're into this kind of thing, if you struggle over this, how do we know that what we're reading is what was written? One resource is called, what is it called? Bring it up, you gotta remind me here. Evidence that demands a verdict. Evidence that demands a verdict. And inside this book, and we have it in most of our resource centers at our campuses, you can look in there and all these kinds of questions about how do we know we're reading what's authentic or not. You can see it there. Also, here's a very, very cool thing for you real geeks out there that really want to chase after this. There's an organization called the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. And they have a website where you can go and they're taking digital photographs of all these different manuscripts that are out there. And you can geek out like crazy and just go into that stuff and really, really explore it. If you're one of those kind of people that's on this side of the line, your bandwidth is very, 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 very narrow. I'm gonna leave you with that. I think on expert advice, a lot of times the reason we buy these things is because we lack information. But I want to take it a little step further. Suppose, I just want to invite you, suppose you really can believe that the author of that paragraph that we just read really is an eyewitness follower of Christ. And what he's writing is really right. The next question you have to ask is, do I believe him, right? How does he go through my belief-o-meter, so to speak? Do I trust the voice that I'm reading? Why would I? Well, I can give you lots of reasons why I think you should and why I do, but here's the main one. What John does throughout the whole book during his signs is that he shows the interplay between belief and doubt. Over and over, every time he records a sign, he shows people believing it, and then he shows people doubting it. And he even does that with the resurrection. Most of us have heard the story of doubting Thomas. You know where that comes from? In John, his main story around the resurrection was a story around someone who doubted it. And the story of doubting Thomas is this. Thomas was a guy who apparently there were 12 disciples originally following Jesus. One betrays him, he's gone. There's 11 left. Thomas, they're all in the same house. Thomas apparently goes down the street to buy a Coke and a Snicker bar at a Thornton's or something like that. And while he's gone, Jesus appears to the other disciples. And he stands in the middle of them. Thomas gets back, walks in the room, and they're all telling him, we've seen the Lord. He's resurrected from the dead. It was amazing. It was great. Every single one of them is telling them this. Listen what the account says. But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples were saying to him, we've seen the Lord. But he said to them, unless I see in his hands the imprint of the nails, and put my finger in the place of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. Now, guys, I don't know how skeptical you are, but that's like there's this side, and then there's Thomas's side, which is like he doesn't have a narrow bandwidth, he has no bandwidth. Think about that for a second. You've hung around with the same people that ostensibly have become some of your best friends in life, and you walk into a room and they all tell you the same exact story and are really excited about it, and you say, I don't believe any of you. You're all liars. I mean, wouldn't that be kind of insulting, quite frankly? Your best friend, hey, we saw the Lord. I was visioning in my mind different personalities. And it says, it wasn't until 8 days later that Jesus showed up to show Thomas the thing. Lucky he ever did anyway. But for 8 days, never believed any of them. Some of you know a person like that. Some of you are sitting next to a person like that. Go ahead and do one of those. But think about it. I don't believe any of you people. That's crazy, but also really, really interesting. And what I love about John is it's like sympathy for belief versus doubt in the interplay. And to me, that speaks of believable things, because one of the original leaders of the Christian church struggled with it so much that he didn't believe in his own best friends. Now, with that said, as we look into belief, I wanted to think about a modern day Thomas, so to speak. And I knew one of our elders' stories. You're about to hear from a guy named Josh. And Josh is one of our elders, kind of an ironic name because he's pretty young. But he's been with us since the very, very beginning. He's on our board. And he's a businessman in this area and a guy who grew up in church. And I asked him to tell his story because he's kind of like a Thomas. This is Josh.
So my grandfather was both a superintendent at General Motors and a pastor at a local church. I still vividly remember the smell of the carpet, the best hiding spots, and the pew we sat in, or in my case, a lot of times under that church every Wednesday night and twice on Sunday. I recall hay rides, youth camp, and the friendships forged through growing up in church. I remember how nervous I was the first time I was asked to preach on Youth Sunday. There's so many strong memories from growing up in church, the vast majority of which are good. But there was also a time that had put everything I'd come to know in serious question. I watched service after service when the congregation would do one more verse of the song, Just As I Am, which is hymn 307, I think, for those who are following. And people would eventually go forward to the front of the room deciding to follow Jesus. I saw it take place at youth events where some kid would do something radical after they got saved. As I reached the place to start seeking out faith for myself in earnest, the primary questions I began to ask of those around me whom I respected were, how do you know when you're forgiven of your sins? How can you be sure that the Bible is reliable? How do you know Jesus is who he says he is? The common answer I was given to these and other good questions that I needed answered shook me to my core. It introduced serious question and crisis into foundational things I had taken for granted up to that point. The answers regularly received from the well-meaning people I asked were, you just have to believe. You're not going to find proof. That's why they call it faith. You'll know in your heart. This birthed and for a season began to cement the idea that everything I knew about being a Christian was based on a glorified fairy tale. There became little distinction in my mind between the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, and Jesus. And while I have no doubt some people require a lower burden of proof than me, it was incomprehensible that I could embrace the Christian worldview if it was in fact void of any actual evidence. And so I began walking with the reality as a man enlightened by my newly discovered truth. I learned during this season how important worldview is to meaning, purpose, and fulfillment in life. All of these things began to erode away as time went by, and I fell into the arms of the rave culture in Detroit. I had the mindset that life is short, life is meaningless, might as well have fun. Through a series of events, I found myself confronted with hopelessness. I began to openly address the nagging questions of meaning, purpose, and fulfillment that had been suppressed for so long. It was at this time an old friend reached out to me. We had a lot in common, including the importance of logic and reason as it pertained to how we viewed life. I quickly discovered that he had become a follower of Jesus, and the conversations we were having were very different from what I'd experienced years before. We talked about evidence, and he pointed me to resources written by people like C.S. Lewis and Ravi Zacharias. We looked into everything from archaeological evidence around the Bible to wrestling with how there couldn't be a moral law without a moral lawgiver to how there couldn't be creation without a creator. It felt as though we left no stone unturned as I slowly transitioned from skeptic to convinced. While believing in what you cannot see is still necessary to be a follower of Jesus, it became really apparent to me there was an overwhelming amount of evidence supporting what and why I believed. Don't get me wrong, there are still plenty of things I don't understand that create questions for me. However, I can say with intellectual integrity, it would take more faith for me to be an atheist than it does to be a follower of Jesus. The claims of Jesus in the Bible need not be protected from intellectual scrutiny. They stand up quite well on their own. I'm keenly aware that everyone doesn't function exactly like me, requiring such a high burden of proof, but the Christian worldview compels everyone, whether you're someone who agrees with it or someone who is adamantly opposed, to wrestle with its claims in more than just a cursory way. If you believe, it's not possible to accomplish God's calling on your life without a deeper look at why you believe. The same is required to dismiss the story of Jesus entirely. The implications of the Bible's claims warrant, at the very least, a deep and thorough look from any skeptic prior to writing it off. Regardless of where you stand right now in terms of your worldview, be brave enough to begin seeking the answers to hard questions. One of my favorite quotes, and I'll leave you with this, is from C.S. Lewis when he wrote, "Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important."
Thank you, Josh. You know, as we think about that quote, and I do believe that with everything in me, it's really true. If this claim that Jesus rose again from the dead really did happen, it's of infinite importance. There could be nothing more important because it answers the ultimates of life. But if it didn't happen, the New Testament itself says, forget this entire deal. And we, like Josh, myself, and many of us around here, we've designed this place, just like John said in the paragraph. He said, listen, I wrote these things that you would believe. And we're very open, just like he is. That's what we want here at One Life. All of One Life was designed to help people who maybe struggle to believe. So we want to be open, we want to dialogue, we want to offer those evidence, and we're dedicating the whole month to those kinds of things on every level. That's what we would challenge you to do. Now let me leave you with a couple of thoughts before we go to something. First of all, he says, I want you to believe. Well, the question is what? Is it just the fact of the resurrection? Yeah, I believe the resurrection happened. I'm going to eat dinner and we're going to do an egg hunt and all that in honor of it. Yeah, I believe it. But he says specifically, I want you to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. What that means is that for a Jewish audience, the Christ, it meant everything that they were looking forward to, everything that they thought of their national life, the holidays they celebrated, the things that they had been trained to think of, he represented the ultimate. For them, it was the Messiah idea. So he was the leader. He was everything. The Christ, or rather Son of God, was for non-Jewish people. And Son of God meant someone who's in charge. You know, guys, there's a whole lot of voices in life. There probably is fake news and all kinds of weird things out there. There's all kinds of voices all over the place vying for your attention, vying for you to say, hey, over here, this is the way, this is the value, this is what we do. And what the resurrection does, and the claim that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, you know what it's saying is, he is the voice you ought to be listening to. And that's what it means to believe. He's the voice I'm gonna listen to above every other voice, including my own. If I come to a fork in the road, I might desire one thing, but if I sense that he says go another way, I would go that way. That's what it means to truly believe in the view of the New Testament. And here's another thing that he says. He says that by believing, you might have life in his name. My story, believe it or not, I wasn't a Thomas. I wasn't a skeptic. I was raised in church. My problem was I did believe it, but I didn't want to do it. And that's a lot of us. My problem was I believed that he was probably up there and didn't approve of a whole lot of things I was doing. And so I would do those things and I would go, Jesus is out there, and he's going to get me one of these days, and I have it coming. And I literally went from guilt trip to not. And I ruined my life, got into a bunch of things I shouldn't have gotten into. And then I would come back, oh, Jesus, please forgive me, and kind of clean me up, and he would, and then I'd go out and do the same bad things again. But then I finally recognized what really turned me around, if you will, was that line, that you may have life in his name. I didn't see him as offering life in his name. I saw him as offering guilt in his name and straighten yourself up, right? But then I found life in his name. Because while I was out doing the wrong things, which I should have felt guilty for because they were wrong, there was one time when I saw them on a deeper level. I saw them leading to nowhere. Not just leading to bad stuff or a destroyed life, but leading to a meaningless life. And what I love about John, he says, I want you to believe so that you will have life in his name. And what's beautiful about that, and I need to take this rebuke, a lot of times those of us who believe and want those of you who don't believe to believe, sometimes when we're not on our game, it's really that we want to win an argument. We want to be right and we want to let you know that you're wrong. But John was motivated by not that. He wanted people to have life in his name. I want what's best for you, and I know at the depths of my being, what's best for you is Jesus is the Christ. He is the Son of God. He did rise again from the dead, and you can have meaning and life, and your mind can be satisfied if you happen to be a skeptic, and your sins can be forgiven for all of us who have plenty of that we've done. And you can have life, and you can have meaning, and you can have hope, and you can have a real and true relationship. In the end, that's what Easter's all about. Just saying, he's the voice, and he's the one that offers life. Now, here's what we're gonna do for the remainder of our time. In the seat pocket in front of you across all of our campuses, there's a card that looks like this. I'm gonna ask you to take it out. And please do this, no matter where you are, no matter, if you're one lifer or not. And by the way, this is a card that we are not going to collect from you. You're going to keep it for yourself. It's just a tool for you. Now, it's kind of a crude thing, but what we wanted to do, because we're going into a month where next week we're going to talk about the true evidences for the resurrection. We're going to talk the next week about doubt and skepticism and how it works and should we be skeptical about these things. We've got a scholar coming in to talk about the historical background. We're going to do a production where we're going to kind of hit you from all different angles on your mind and those kinds of things. But what this is designed to do is we decided just as a different way to reflect on these things is it gives kind of a numbers system. And what's going to happen is I'm going to pitch back to the campuses here in a moment. And there's some music that's going to play. And what we're going to do is just leave you alone with your own thoughts before God and yourself. And we've got questions here that you kind of rank yourself on. It looks like one of those SAT things. Again, it's kind of crude, but just kind of rank yourself and then total up the numbers. And you place a number here. And on the other side, it gives you next steps for wherever you are. If you're on the highest numbers and you're not skeptical at all, well, it'll give you some next steps. And if you're at the bottom of all of them, it'll give you some next steps as well. Because, just like John, he said, I could have said a lot of things, but these things were said so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, who really, truly did rise again from the dead. I'm going to pitch it back to our campuses.